Good morning, everyone. On behalf of AML Center, I would like to welcome you all to our ad hoc online training session, MiCA and the travel rule. What do we need to know? Before we begin, I will give you the short introduction into the housekeeping rules, and then what are we planning to cover here today. So my name is Greta Barkauskene. I am an expert in AML working for the centers team. Together with me, I have other colleagues that will be closely monitoring the chat. So you, as always, will be having a possibility to ask the questions, share your opinions, and this is very welcome coming from you. Now, this session is an ad hoc session. Therefore, it was planned reflecting on the requests from our community and also looking into the situation right now that we have MiCA in power and we have the transfer of funds regulation in power, and we need to stick to somewhat new rules. And we thought that it would be a great idea to reflect on the efficiency of the travel rule and what we really need to know. So today's session is going to be recorded, and the recording you will be able to find after the training. The participation certificates will be issued to those who attended the training session for at least 70% of the time. We would like to kindly remind you that in order for us to be able to see that you were there with us, please do not minimize the window. And if you are working on two screens, I would suggest not engaging in some side activities on the other screen, because we also might not be able to track your presence that you were here with us. After this training session, respecting your privacy and we do not have the information regarding your registration. All the information is being erased from our system, so we will not be able to retrieve that certificate if you haven't received it. So be so kind and dedicate your attention to the training and stick with us for at least 70% of the time, and you will be shortly receiving the certificate. So the structure of our training session here today, we will begin with the first discussion regarding the efficiency of the travel rule and how it is impacting our society with our dear guest trainer, Dr. Nina Luisa Siedler. She's a practicing lawyer with a vast experience in the field. She's also the lecturer and expert in crypto assets. So Nina, hello. I'm really happy to have you here today.
Thank you very much, Greta. And thank you very much for hearing me, despite knowing that I might share some controversial opinions on this topic. Thank you.
No problem at all. We are really happy to have you. After a session with Nina, we're going to have a break for 10 minutes for everyone just to grab a glass of water and for us to catch a breath. And then we continue with our another superstar host, superstar guest, Nathan Catania with X-Reg Consulting. He is experienced speaker, lecturer, and he is an expert in crypto assets field as well. So we are very happy to have Nathan with us as well. Hello, Nathan.
Hi, morning, everyone. Good to be here.
Likewise, very nice to have you. So Nathan will be covering the practical aspects of complying with the travel rule. And after Nathan's session, we're going to have Q&A session. So you are very welcome to raise the questions, share your observations, and comment on what you're hearing and what you are seeing even in your practical field, your daily activities. We are very happy to hear you out. However, we will not be answering the questions right away. Instead, we're gonna just focus on that Q&A session, and we will try to use the time available to us to answer these questions in full detail. So I encourage you to share and be kind in that chat box that is available to you. And without further ado, I guess we're gonna just jump into the first part of our trainings. So this is somewhat new activity that we are trying, and the discussion between two experts in crypto assets is not something that AML Center has done before in the past, at least in our online training sessions. And our audience might not be also very used to this. But we believe that raising the questions that are related to very long established beliefs and truths, and revisiting these things might be beneficial to all of us in order to reach that efficiency and protect the rules, the values that we are as financial fighters standing for. So I'm very happy that Nina suggested this very fine discussion regarding the efficiency of the travel rule and what are the implications to the society in general. So coming from very different backgrounds and also dedicating some time to raising the expertise in the crypto sector, Nina and I will have that discussion, trying to think about travel rule from a little bit different angle. So a little introduction into this discussion, and we will begin. To some of you that might not be aware, the travel rule has been here for a very long time, actually. It was introduced in the United States by the Bank Secrecy Act in 1996. And it was done not for just making financial institutions, let's say, suffer and do more work. It actually was introduced to fight crime as a countermeasure to growing money laundering efforts by drug cartels. So as a purpose to identify the data and create the paper trail for authorities to follow, as in providing law enforcement with the very valuable needed data as evidence, travel rule made its entrance into the world. In 2001, we had FATF updated its recommendations, and especially recommendation 16. And here we are, we have the travel rule. It's been here for a very long time. What everybody seems not to be talking that much about is that the travel rule applies to all the transactions, regardless whether they are involving criminals. So it is implicating me, you, Nina, everyone. This means that personal information is being transferred and digital footprint is being created without the control of data subject. So that's the angle that Nina and I will be discussing, and I would like to welcome Nina just to share the thoughts on the matter. What do you think about this?
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me maybe start this way. Imagine walking into a cafe and paying for your coffee with a 10 euro note. Now, imagine that before you're allowed to pay, the barista is asking for your full name, date of birth, home address, and your national ID number. That sounds absurd, right? But in the digital world, this is what happens. Every crypto asset transfer, no matter how small, may trigger the transfer of your personal data. And not only your data, but also the recipient's data. So the travel rule, intended to fight serious crime, now subjects even ordinary transactions to scrutiny. This concept, as you mentioned, was invented in the 1990s, and the concept was clear: if we can trace the money, we can identify the criminal. But over time, the thresholds decreased. I think they started with 10K, 10,000, and are now down to 1,000 in the traditional financial world and down to 0 in crypto. But while the scope expanded by the thresholds decreasing, the proportionality did not. Think about this: a rule designed to fight drug cartels is now applied to teenagers, paying in crypto for a Coke. So the tool hasn't evolved much to the modern landscape, unfortunately.
Yes, it's clearly visible that we are sticking with a very old rule, and there are seemingly valid criticisms regarding the requirement to transfer really vast amounts of personal information. Ina, would you like to develop, to explore the thought that what about the information and the amount of information that we are sharing? Is it enough, or is it maybe too much?
Yeah, I think you always need to consider that sharing personal information touches everyone's privacy rights, which are established in Article 8 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights. Sorry, give me just a second. Sorry for this, but the door would keep ringing otherwise. All right, so I was saying that sharing personal information clearly touches your privacy rights, right? And they have the privacy right have a constitutional level. And while personal data obviously can be processed on the basis of consent of the person concerned or on the basis of some legitimate interest laid down by law, any such infringement of your privacy rights must be proportionate and necessary according to the Treaty of the European Union. So since 2018, GDPR enforcement resulted in nearly 6 billion in fines across the EU, and financial institutions have also been among the top targets of ransomware and data breaches. In 2023 alone, the Move IT breach impacted nearly 3,000 institutions globally, exposing the data of over 90 million individuals. So when private companies collect data just in case, as is mandated by the travel rule, they become high-value targets. I always like to call them data honeypots. So every additional data point becomes a liability for society. And therefore, the question arises whether this constant data forwarding is truly necessary. And despite the fact, and we pre-discussed this, that the travel rule had been invented like 30 years ago and is applied for at least 20 years, there is basically no data whatsoever about the efficiency of this rule. So how can something that had not been able to prove its efficiency for 20 years, for 2 decades, how can it be necessary? And, rumors say from people who had been involved back in 1995 when this rule was first discussed, that actually the purpose of this rule has never been to fight back money laundering. So yeah, I think the criticism is very valuable.
Thank you so much for delving a little bit deeper. And I think we're gonna go a little bit down the spiral because there are criticisms, and I would really love to explore that. That said, I encourage the audience to share their opinions in the chat. What do you think? Are the criticisms valid? And also encourage everyone, even after this training session, to keep on researching and formulating your own opinions. Maybe you severely disagree and are the advocates for the travel rule. We would love to hear that. Now, this is very, very valid points that you are making. And I was thinking about this yesterday before the training, and I was thinking, okay, so now in this training session, we are all connected online. Us in Vilnius and you in Berlin, and but we are all connecting from the EU. And the travel rule and it being implemented in the recommendation 16 by the VADA, it became somewhat mandatory all around the world. So in these cases, we have some transactions are being conducted not just between the parties within the EU. We have transactions going to other countries, and the privacy protection rules and legal acts safeguarding it might be quite different in different countries. And I wonder, are we facing somewhat of legal uncertainty when everyone's seemingly implementing the recommendation 16 in their own way and have different laws protecting the personal information and privacy? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, that's also a valid point. Like the expansion of, let's call it, surveillance infrastructure, right? Even under the banner of anti-money laundering and counter-finance terrorism, clearly introduces geopolitical and cybersecurity risk, right? So surveillance by adversarial states, the more data we collect centrally, the more vulnerable it becomes to misuse, especially if such data is shared internationally via the travel rule implementation frameworks or the upcoming UN Cybercrime Convention. I highly recommend you to look into that one. So imagine a scenario where a neighboring authoritarian regime obtains transaction metadata from users across border, even pseudonymous blockchain data when combined with off-chain identity information can de-anonymize opposition figures, whistleblowers, or refugees. And centralized databases become honeypots for hackers, including state actors and cybercriminals and corporate saboteurs. Financial institutions already report increasing attacks, and I already mentioned, there had been a lot of compromised personal data. So really, in my view, privacy is not the opposite of security. It is a precondition for freedom. It enables the press to investigate corruption. It protects minority groups from discrimination, and it allows citizens to dissent without fear. So the moment we start working against privacy or limiting privacy is I think quite critical. And also, the FATF recommendations, they are not applied, in the same manner throughout the globe. Look only at the thresholds, like FATF recommends collecting data for transfers above 1,000 euro or USD, but the US, for instance, applies a higher threshold of 3,000, while the EU lowered the threshold to 0 for crypto. And this is only, one very obvious variance in regional implementation. There are many, many further differences when you look into details. And that disparity certainly sparked debates on global consistency and effectiveness as well.
Thank you for exploring that question in detail. And actually, I truly can relate to the concerns regarding the hacks and surveillance by unfriendly neighboring countries. I think here in Lithuania, we are very aware of the risks, especially that in the public sources, we hear that unfriendly countries try to sabotage some operations with the post services, and probably everyone still remembers the inflammatory packages being transferred. And this is really valid concern, I think, when we are having vast amounts of information being transferred. And now we are very occupied in understanding what information needs to be sent and how to comply properly, that everything is gathered and the initiator of the transaction has everything. On the other hand, there's that other side, and I'm not so sure if we are dedicating enough attention to it. Are we there protecting that data? Are we there just piling it up for some unfriendly actor to just break in, take it, and cause more damage and use that information against us? So this is really valid concern, and I think it could be another topic for entirely another debate with the cybersecurity people. But I'm really glad that you are raising this concern. And I think that potential risks of the surveillance and the cyber questions are really important, and the fact that we are talking is probably that step that we need forward in readdressing and reassessing things that have been established very long time ago. Now, as we were starting this conversation saying the travel rule is almost 30 years old. It's been introduced in the US, then it was incorporated into the FATF's recommendations. and now everybody is applying it a little bit differently. So EU went with strict regulation, and now we have a zero threshold and vast amounts of information to be collected and to be transferred, while the other countries might not be applying the same thresholds and the same rules towards transferring that information and also towards safeguarding that information. So I was wondering, perhaps that move towards crypto sector, asking crypto companies to implement the rule that is very, very old, and the crypto sector and fintech community as well are known to be the ones that driving for the change, driving for the technological evolution. For example, finding new ways how to identify people, finding new ways how to make the procedures not as long and difficult when it comes to complying and ensuring that that money laundering prevention. But we have the travel rule. It's here. It needs to be implemented. And the question is it really a need that we need to just blindly go and with and just find the ways how to comply? And maybe the times are calling for the evaluation of this rule. Maybe the discussion is needed, and maybe we need to say that maybe we need to let the travel rule rest. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree that it's time for re-evaluating this rule, and specifically when considering some side effects of it, which we didn't even touch upon yet. So let's consider the story of like Somali diaspora community in some large city in Europe, and many members send remittances home where no formal banking exists. So following AML tightening, their accounts had often been closed, not because they did anything wrong, but due to geographic risk. Now imagine the consequences: families deprived of essential funds, businesses disrupted, and communities forced to go underground. Hawala networks, which are per se informal, opaque, and beyond regulatory net, they surged in usage. And the European Banking Authority itself has explicitly warned that such de-risking practices, as we see throughout in the banking sector, undermine financial inclusion and ultimately violate EU goals. So when we exclude people from financial systems in the name of security, we don't stop the flow of money, right? We push them into the shadow. And next thing, FATF neutral evaluation reports, they score countries on technical compliance and effectiveness. But the latter, the effectiveness, often becomes a simple, check the box exercise. Take this example. Country A submits over 2 million transaction reports annually, but their conviction rates remain very, very flat. So why? Because enforcement teams are overwhelmed by false positives. Instead of focusing on the serious threats, they are triaging irrelevant noise. And eventually, when you're so overwhelmed, you stop responding. So that's what's happened when we equate quantity with quality, so to speak. And take a look at the numbers of money laundering prosecutions and convictions in the UK and in the US. Unfortunately, with a quick research, those were the two countries I could find some. It shows a steady decline over the past 10 years, and that clearly is showing the effects I just described. Then next point, budget split. Greta, let me ask this. If you have, as a society, you have an amount of 100 for fighting crime. So how much of this 100 would you propose to allocate on police work? Including traffic controls, securing state visits, and football games with violent hooligans, and prosecution of theft, burglary and murder and manslaughter, and much more. And how much would you dedicate to compliance costs for chasing the profits from successful crimes being potentially money laundered? So what would you propose, the split of the 100?
That's a very interesting question. And I think that's the question that people are still looking at the answers for. What is the golden ratio of splitting the money? I guess this is the personal take, and in no way a recommendation how it should be done. But clearly, if we are dedicating money towards compliance, it cannot take all the budgets. So I think that prevention needs to have that significant portion of the funds. And then when we talk about successfully laundered money, it still needs to get that attention and needs to have people working on that. But it cannot eat up all the budget. That would be my answer. It's not very clear,
Yeah.
but
And I also, I found not many, but I found some numbers, again, from the UK. So the cost of AML in 2023 had been reported to be about 28.7 billion, right, per annum. That is kind of half of the UK's whole defense budget. And not only let that resonate, but it is 50% higher than the UK's annual police funding, which is 17 billion. So that kind of doesn't sound very reasonable, does it? So police funding shouldn't be so much lower than the compliance cost. And both types of costs are borne by us as a society, right? It's not the rich banks that are paying for it. It ultimately trickles down to every one of us. And I found a quote from Sir Howard Davis, former chairman of NatWest, who called the regime remarkably burdensome, delivering too few prosecutions. So when reporting becomes a ritual, effectiveness gets lost in the process. Compliance with the travel rule isn't free. Big banks spend millions on transaction monitoring systems, staff training, audits, legal advice, right? And smaller firms, especially fintech and crypto, face existential challenges. They often cannot afford the regulatory infrastructure that is required. In EMEA alone, compliance costs are reported to be 85 billion, and globally, that figure is way beyond 200 billion. And the unintended consequence by this is, guess what? Reduced competition, consolidated power, fewer choices for consumers. Ultimately, these costs trickle down. Higher fees, lost access, and an erosion of trust in the system overall. So in summary, the travel rule endangers the privacy of everyone. It increases the number of the unbanked, pushing them into the shadow. And it floods the police with useless, suspicious transaction reports, hiding the important information they should get and look at first. And it results in completely unreasonable share of the total budget spent on fighting crime. Leads to the creation of monopolies in the financial services sector. So yes, I would call for a dramatic reevaluation.
Wow, these are really valid concerns, and thank you, Nina, for raising those because I think we don't talk enough, because these are the topics that are not very comfortable for us to go into, as we are used to something that we have to do, and the first instinct as a compliance person or the financial crime fighter is to find the ways how to comply with the rules. And in no way I am calling for abandoning the travel rule as of now, but rethinking some aspects of it is a very, very valuable exercise, I think. And thanks for raising those concerns. And I would like to delve deeper a little bit into these few points that you mentioned. And what I really enjoyed hearing from you was a very interesting take on us spending a lot of money just to check the box, right? And it requires lots and lots of people to do that. I guess what is the most expensive in this field? It's labor. It's the work that we have to put into it. So the building huge systems around it, hiring a lot of people that are looking into that information. And I'm really glad that you are raising the question, what is the efficiency? Have we measured if it's paying off or we are just doing the job for the sake of doing it? So what is that added value? Does it really add to the suspicious transactions being observed, timely, suspended or frozen and being reported to the FIU? And can FIU actually do enough with that information? Probably will not get the answer as of now in this conversation, but these are the questions that I also would like everyone in our audience to bring back home with them and try to answer to themselves. Is it really just a tedious work for the sake of doing, or are we actually making a change and impact here? So I would like to ask you to delve a little bit deeper with me, but the thoughts, when we are building the transaction monitoring systems based on the information that we are receiving because of the travel rule, am I correct that you also were not able to find what is the efficiency and what are the numbers that would say that this is adding colossally to the success of timely reporting and investigations being successful in the courts? Because I haven't. What about you?
No, me neither. And actually, we built a timeline about the history of the travel rule already 2 years ago. And then we had the idea that we said, okay, let's compare, how many suspicious transaction reports had been filed before the introduction of the travel rule and thereafter. And, how many of those filings actually led to prosecutors stepping up, and, how many convictions followed from there, right? So at least these three numbers I try to get here in Germany for each year. But, I couldn't get my hands on it so far. Still working on it. But these numbers are not available, readily available at least.
Um, yes, that's probably would be the same situation in other countries as well, because though my research be preparing for this training session was not that extensive, and maybe somebody has it, but I wasn't able to find it. But it would be really interesting to see what is the success rate, because I have been working in the past in the private sector for a short period of time. I also had this chance of laying my hands on the monitoring systems and see how many false positives they are generating. And people have to also look into it. And obviously, not all the monitoring systems are built based on the travel rule information, but there are quite some scenarios that are. And another concern that I would like to discuss with you is about this requirement for the crypto sector now to follow the travel rule. And for them, it's rather new. And crypto sector is a little bit different than the traditional financial system sector. Everyone is looking for innovation, and when they have to follow almost 30 years old rule, it's sometimes it's even difficult to comprehend why are we doing this, and or are we doing enough, because the banks are quite familiar with the system. They know what they need to do, what's expected from them, so they went all that way. For the crypto companies, though, it is somewhat a new journey. And obviously, mistakes could happen, some data not being collected, or some data might be misinterpreted, especially when we are raising questions about, self-hosted wallets and obligations related to that. What if we misinterpret the data? And what happens then? And my concern is that when we are facing the penalties, and maybe Nathan could jump into in the Q&A session later on, being ex-regulator, everyone's a little bit afraid that the regulators might penalize us if we are not following strictly. And that could also create a very really bad pattern of preventing reporting. Where I'm getting at is that when we don't have enough information or we don't understand that information, though we are that sector under magnifying glass, or at least we feel that way, it could be so that lots and lots of suspicious transaction reports are being sent to the FIUs because either we don't have the data or we don't understand what we see, and that could be the case in this situation. What do you think?
Well, I mean, the system clearly incentivizes the financial services and crypto service providers to issue rather more than less transaction reports, suspicious transaction reports. Everybody is afraid of fines, right? And you never get a fine for over-reporting, but you clearly get one if you missed an important one. So the incentives should also be rethought, so that, simply flooding the FIUs with useless suspicious transaction reports should not be incentivized, right? So there should be incentivized to really do good checkups, and if you then miss one, maybe importance should be put more on reporting useful data than just reporting anything. So I think that's pretty clear. In Germany, we had this huge scandal due to a really high backlog of our former, FIU until they restructured it. So you basically never get an answer within the 3 days that you have to put a transaction on hold, and then you're basically lost and don't know what to do because you're still supposed to do an evaluation whether you let the transaction pass or not. So actually, I see a systemic lack of enforcement on the state actor side here. And that certainly needs to be worked on, because that is a clear sign that the system doesn't work. And we are losing, the trust of everybody if we invent, such expensive rules. And then there is no follow up on the state side of things, right? So, that's another reason why we need to work on this rule.
Thank you for diving into this with me, and because I was asking myself as well, am I the only one that sees the potential dangers of just spending a lot of money and not creating any added value with this? Though I believe that there could be some good outcomes. We are not saying that that in all the times this is not helping, but what probably is the question here? Is it necessary to have the travel rule to still successfully identify suspicious activity happening? And I think if we don't have these numbers and if we don't have that research and look into the question from different angles, public and the private sector, that's a little bit difficult to say. So we are a bit on a more not entirely speculative side, but we see that all the concerns are there, but we don't know the numbers. And when we say travel rule is the reason why, not the reason, but is there just to ensure that we have this timely reporting. This is there for effective money laundering prevention. And asking this question is also making us think how we are approaching things. And I'm afraid that we are moving towards doing things out of habit just because it's been long enough and we have to do it. And what's actually proven very, very valuable in investigations and timely reporting and in being successful was that creative, innovative thinking, critical thinking. When we ask questions, what are we seeing? Is it making any sense? And what are the new patterns evolving? So I'm afraid that with burdensome amount of work, we might stop thinking critically and just report out of habit. Yeah. And therefore, it is very concerning to me that instead of focusing and dedicating our resources that are quite limited, we cannot just expand forever and hire new people and spend all the budget on compliance. Clearly, it is not very effective, but instead we might find new ways. So on that final note that we are moving towards, the end of our discussion. This is the personal question I would like to ask you. Do you really personally think that the travel rule helps to identify the suspicious activity, or this is really us being very sentimental, and other factors can be great components in timely identification, freezing the assets, and travel rule needs really to go because it served its purpose if it did, and we need to find better ways and be more effective instead of just doing things out of habit and spending a lot of money.
Well, with the number of suspicious transaction reports skyrocketing, the current system definitely reached its limit, right? The risk-based approach is so vague, and the low-risk category is basically not applied anymore. It's not practically not existing, and the flood of reports is not manageable. So, yes, I think we should rethink not only the rule but also who is setting them. So, while the Financial Action Task Force plays a critical role in setting international standards, we wouldn't be where we are without the FATF. Its legitimacy as a global rulemaker had always been challenged. FATF is an intergovernmental body established back in the 90s by G7. It has no treaty base, right? It's not a treaty-based organization. It has no formal legal authority. And its mandate is to set these standards, global AML CFT standards, mainly through recommendations, right? Which are technically legally non-binding, but de facto are enforced through blacklisting and graylisting mechanisms. So FATF guidelines significantly shape the national policies worldwide, and yet it operates without direct democratic oversight, and that raises questions about accountability, recommendation, transparency. And as we rethink the travel rule, it's equally vital to revisit who sets these global norms and on what basis. There is a number of innovative approaches emerging that leverages, up-to-date technology to enhance both efficiency and privacy, right? I can, drop some names without really being capable of explaining them in detail, but I think it's worth exploring those further, like zero-knowledge AML, privacy-preserving collaborated machine learning, secure multi-party computation for risk analysis, and so forth, right? I also would like to stress again that we should focus again more on preventing crime to start with. The social costs of AML are extremely high. And if we would spend more on fighting crime in the first place, we would presumably not need to bear that heavy burden of compliance costs. AML is secondary to crime prevention. And you're right, it still needs its focus, but, put it into the right priority compared to overall fighting against financial crime as a society. So, it can help, specifically since police is organized national, and the travel rule certainly helps by giving, the national police a local contact point for obtaining the data. But that's maybe then the problem that we should turn to and solve instead of keeping on sending around personal data across the globe.
Thank you, Nina, so much for wrapping it up in a very, very meaningful way. We're not just criticizing, but we're also proposing some ways forward. And I am very happy that we had this discussion addressing the issues that are here for everyone to see, and everyone probably was thinking about one or the other aspect, or maybe all of them during their career as well, because we have the community of the compliance officers here in the audience as well. So probably they had these questions to themselves. Why are we doing all of these tasks that sometimes are very tedious, but result with zero results? So thank you so much for sharing your insights. And I am encouraging everyone to revisit that topic even after the training and think for themselves. What do you think? Are we correct? Maybe we are utterly wrong. And if you have any thoughts, please write them in the chat. We will be more than happy to return to this conversation and now involve you and your observations. But asking these questions is crucially important, and looking into the innovative solutions like zero knowledge proof and others might be the way forward, because we can do better, and I think that we will do better. But as of now, we still need to comply, and I know that the regulators are quite demanding when they are asking, what did you do to prevent financial crime in your organization, and rightfully so. So in the second part, we're going to have Nathan, who is going to help us navigate that regulatory landscape that is ever changing. And I hope that everyone will hear more about what's needed to be done as of now, what we need to comply, till we revisit that travel rule and make some changes potentially in the future. So thank you, Nina. Looking forward for Nathan's presentation in 10 minutes, because we are going into the break a little bit early. So in 10 minutes, I would be really happy to see you all back. And now it's time for us to grab that water and catch a breath. See you soon.
Thank
you. Welcome back, everyone. Our break is over. I hope that you managed to catch the breath, grab that glass of water or coffee or tea. And we are starting the second part of our training session. As promised, we have Nathan, ex-regulator, expert in crypto assets and audit from X-Reg Consulting. He's going to help us navigating the travel rule in the EU. With the ever-changing landscape, we need to know, and sometimes it's very difficult. So Nathan is here to help us out. So Nathan, the floor is yours. You are very welcome to start.
Great, and thank you for having me. A bit of a tough act to follow because we've seen the struggles and questioned the inefficiencies of the travel rule, and it's my job now to tell you it's here. We need to comply and explain how we can navigate through it. But just a bit of a background. So as Greta said, I'm an ex-regulator. I was part of the team in Gibraltar that were licensing and supervising VASPs as from 2018. And myself and my firm, we've actually been involved in the travel for some time. As a regulator, we were involved in some of the discussions at the FATF plenary when VAs and VASPs were first brought into scope by the FATF. And interestingly, the travel rule wasn't part of the conversation until the very last minute when our friends in the US decided to say, wait a minute, what about wire transfers for crypto? And last minute recommendation 16 was applied to VAs and VASP transfers. So it was a very last minute thing. There was a lot of pushback by industry and even other countries at the time, even at FATF level. But unfortunately, it was brought into the recommendations, and then everything that flows through it has led us to where we are. I agree with a lot of what was said in the prior discussion as well. I think there's a lot of challenges with the travel rule. I think there's risks in terms of privacy, in terms of efficiency, and whether it's achieving its required outcomes. I would also question that as well, but hopefully I can help you navigate the travel rule in as least a painful way as possible. Slightly playing devil's advocate to the last session, I think one of the challenges we've seen with the travel rule as well is, and I'll cover it in the presentation, is that it hasn't been equally implemented across jurisdictions. And even so, it hasn't even been enforced effectively across jurisdictions as well. So even the jurisdictions that have legislated for the travel rule, there's actually very little enforcement by certain jurisdictions as well. So it's quite hard to assess how effective the travel rule is when it's just some lines in a piece of legislation and no one's actually implementing it properly. So it could be a case that maybe years from now, we have less challenges on the travel rule because it's actually been implemented properly. But again, I just thought I'd mention that because it's something worth thinking about. So just to cover the agenda, I'll give a brief history on the travel rule, but I think some of that's already been covered. So I'll go through that quite quickly. And then we'll look really at how the travel rule has come to be, specifically in Europe, which is where we're focused, and that flows from the FATF. And then I'll discuss some practical challenges and some ways that you can effectively implement the travel rule in your organizations as well. I will be taking questions at the end, so feel free to jot down any questions while we're going through this session. So what is a travel rule? I'm starting off here with some text from the FATF, just so we can really break it down. And again, this comes really from a recommendation in the FATF standards. So as you know, the FATF is an intergovernmental body and they set global standards on AML, CFT, and CPF. And what they do is they agree on recommendations, which you'll find are a bit stronger than recommendations, because then those recommendations flow through to countries' evaluations. So I guess they're recommendations with teeth is sometimes the way we describe them. And these recommendations are set on countries. The countries then need to implement the recommendations into their local laws and effectively supervise and make sure that those recommendations are being followed locally. So FATF set these global standards, and then those standards need to be considered and transposed into local law. And that's where you get significant challenges, which we'll cover later as well, because they're not always equally implemented across countries, and you get diverging approaches and challenges as well. But this is all coming, the travel rule specifically is coming from what is known as Recommendation 16, and is commonly called travel rule or wire transfer requirements. It was in place in the US for some time, and then became a global standard as well. And what it's saying here is that countries should ensure that originating VASPs obtain and hold required and accurate originate information and required beneficiary information on virtual asset transfers. So there's certain information that needs to be captured when transferring virtual assets between VASPs, and VASPs are virtual asset service providers, which in Europe are referred to as crypto asset service providers. There's also other interesting, and I think some key words here, which is that the information needs to be transmitted immediately and securely. And there's a lot of challenges in terms of what that means, especially in a crypto context. And I think we need to remember, and it was discussed in the earlier session, is that crypto is different to traditional money flows. In the traditional monetary system, when value is sent from one party to another, the message and the value transfer happens at the same time, effectively. With crypto, we've had to build this complete new system because the value can be transferred from one person to another with the use of a wallet, and there's no messaging system that occurs between providers, wallets. The blockchain is not a messaging system. I guess you could maybe build a blockchain with an inbuilt messaging system, but 99.9% of crypto right now doesn't have this inherent messaging system inbuilt, which has been a huge challenge. So, and I think that's, again, looking at criticisms of the travel rule, I think that maybe was not appreciated as much as it could have. And all they said was, let's make these guys comply with this rule without thinking practically how difficult it would be as well. Okay, so what is the travel rule effectively? I mean, we discussed it in the previous session. It's a regulation that requires certain information to be shared when transactions or transfers occur. between two service providers. So it's originating from traditional regulation, wire transfers. The purpose and the goal of this rule is to really prevent money laundering and terrorist financing. Question as to how effective this rule is in achieving that, but that's where it's coming from. And the key here really, one of the risks that was identified is that when value is being transferred from one VASP to another VASP, it's difficult for law enforcement to trace those transactions. VASPs have been described as black boxes in the past, where once you're tracing transactions through the blockchain, for example, as a law enforcement agency, as soon as it hits a VASP, it's very difficult to identify and to follow the flow of the transactions. But again, crypto is different, and I think that's where this huge challenge has arisen when it comes to implementing the travel rule effectively as well. Okay, so again, what we are trying to do here, and again, there's a big difference in terms of what we are seeking to achieve and the actual success. But the concept and the thought behind this is to allow for this tracing of information and helping law enforcement to trace these illicit financial flows. This is just a timeline. I think we've already covered this previously, but again, it's just showing what's happened and how we get to where we are. And I think this also fits in with the wider perspective on crypto regulation. So really prior to 2018, 2019, crypto was largely unregulated globally. It wasn't until 2018 when the FATF clarified that the standards will apply to VAs and VASPs, and countries need to regulate crypto from an AML perspective. And then 2019, when they published the guidance, that there wasn't significant international pressure on jurisdictions to start regulating crypto. And then we've seen a lot of developments since. We saw the MiCA regime being built. We've seen the TFR that also applies to authorized entities in Europe. So globally and gradually, crypto is becoming more and more regulated, at least from an AML CFT perspective, because there's this significant pressure internationally on countries to regulate crypto for AML. And we've seen that happening. So very few jurisdictions now do not have at least a registration regime from an AML perspective. And part of complying with this AML regime, which is mandated by the FATF, is also implementing the travel rule. So we're not operating in a vacuum here. The travel rule is a significant part and a painful part of a bigger picture, which is crypto is becoming more regulated. Similar AML CFT standards are being applied to crypto, as you would see in banking and other traditional finance. And even beyond that, and this is maybe going beyond the remit of this session, is we're also seeing additional standards being imposed on crypto businesses that go even beyond AML. So given a lot of the issues we've seen in the industry in the past, we've seen failures, we've seen frauds, a lot of traditional financial regulatory principles and standards now are being applied to crypto as well. And in fact, the whole MiCA regime barely even touches AML. It brings in a whole load of other requirements, including prudential and safeguarding of customer assets. These are all traditional risks that we've seen in other financial services businesses that are being applied to VASP and CASPs as well. Okay, so the history, which we covered in the timeline, is there. We've seen a lot of guidance come out of FATF. Interestingly as well, which we've seen since the guidance was published in 2019, is the FATF like to publish what they call, or they used to call 12-month reviews, and now they call targeted updates. So every year, the FATF actually issue a report explaining how jurisdictions are progressing with the implementation of the standards. They're always disappointed, surprise, surprise, at the lack of progress that countries are making. And they're always particularly disappointed at the lack of progress that countries are making with the travel rule as well. So if we think of like the way countries are implementing AML CFT regulation for crypto and the progress that is being made, the travel rule is always even lagging behind that progress. So you have a lot of countries that may have registration, licensing regimes for crypto asset service providers or virtual asset service providers or whatever they decide to call them in their jurisdictions, the travel rule is usually lagging behind that. So some countries may have regimes in place, but either they haven't legislated for the travel rule or they haven't enforced the travel rule accurately as well. So that's the state we're in. And I think that also adds to like the challenges that we're seeing globally in terms of implementation, because every country's at a different stage of implementation as well. Okay, this is the travel rule in a nutshell. This is based on the FATF guidance. It's slightly different in Europe, and we'll cover that in a minute. But effectively, this is what you need to do as a VASP. So you need to obtain, hold, and submit to the beneficiary certain information. And then that beneficiary will also need to share certain information with the originator. Okay, so when there's a value transfer between one VASP to another, they effectively need to share certain customer information. Okay, and here's where you have some risks in terms of privacy and otherwise, because this is quite confidential and personal information that is being asked to be shared between these entities. And it needs to be immediate, as we saw before as well, which is another significant challenge because of this split between crypto value transfer and messaging. So what the FATF basically said is we need to create a SWIFT for crypto, which did not exist at the time. And we need all VASPs globally to partake in this messaging infrastructure that did not exist at the time as well. Okay, so what do they do to submit under the travel rule? We saw it before. So there's certain originator information that needs to be shared, beneficiary information that needs to be shared. They set a threshold of €1,000, dollars. But again, the issues we see with implementation is that once countries decide what to do in their national regimes, they can choose lower thresholds. And as Nina rightfully mentioned before, Europe picked a threshold of 0, which is not very helpful for a number of reasons, which we'll cover in a minute as well. Okay, so let's move into the TFR. So as I mentioned, FATF sets these non-binding but slightly binding standards on countries, because if not, you may fail your mutual evaluation. Countries then embed it into their local legislation. And the way it was embedded in the EU was via the AML package and the TFR. Okay, so what is a TFR? It's a regulation that basically transposes the travel rule into Europe. It's supposed to align the requirements in Europe with the FATF's travel rule, as we mentioned. But there are slight differences in their application. So the key one, I think, or one of the main ones, is that there's no de minimis threshold. So the travel rule needs to be applied for every transaction, which is a significant challenge. There's also higher information requirements than the FATF set, which is an added bonus. So you need to do even more than you would have if the FATF standard was applied as written. It doesn't apply to transfers between self-hosted wallets, which is a critical one. So if I am sending Nina some Bitcoin from my self-hosted Bitcoin wallet to Nina's self-hosted Bitcoin wallet, the travel won't apply because there's simply no CASP in the transaction chain by which needs to comply with the travel rule. So pure on-chain transactions between two on-chain wallets that are unhosted and not controlled by a CASP are not subject to the travel rule, thankfully. Let's hope that never ever happens, because that would be even more catastrophic than what we already have. So that at least is set. But there are certain requirements when there are transfers between a CASP and a self-hosted wallet, and that's where we see some implementation challenges as well, because communicating between two CASPs is challenging enough, but trying to communicate with an individual or a business that has a self-hosted wallet is another level of complexity as well. And even more challenging is that you need to actually prove wallet ownership for transfers above 1,000 euros. So here they do apply a threshold of 1,000 euros, but it's for proof of wallet ownership. So there's certain information that needs to be exchanged below 1,000 euros. Above 1,000 euros, you actually need to prove ownership. And that's been a significant challenge for CASPs, which we can cover in a minute as well. Another element of the travel rule, which is not fully appreciated in many jurisdictions, is there's a need for counterparty VASP due diligence. So you also, as a CASP, need to understand who your counterparty is, and you need to take a risk-based approach to whether you want to even deal with that counterparty, and whether you can send or receive not just the information, but transactions with those counterparts. Okay, so this regulation, TFR, applies to crypto asset and fund transfers. The aim again here is to prevent money laundering, terrorist financing by ensuring traceability of certain information. It covers all CASPs and PSPs in Europe. It applies to all transfers, no minimum, and it aligns with imposed stricter standards, as I said. The key requirements, again, very similar to what we see in the FATF guidance, is to transmit originator and beneficiary information with these transfers. But there's certain heightened requirements in terms of what information needs to be communicated here in Europe. So it needs to include things like the full name, address, ID number, or date and place of birth, account details. And then again, this requirement that is coming really from the FATF is that you need to send data securely and either concurrent with or ahead of transaction execution. So the crypto transaction needs to be sent at the same time, or maybe think of it the other way around. The messaging needs to happen at the same time or before the crypto transaction. Okay, where can we see challenges with this? The biggest challenge I see, and I've seen with clients and other firms, is if you think about the way crypto asset transfers work and how the blockchain works, is that you cannot block incoming transactions, especially. So it's a significant challenge when receiving transactions more than when you're sending transactions, because as a CASP, if you have your own client wallets and you receive funds into one of those wallets, you can't block it. You can maybe restrict the client seeing it or accessing it because it's a custodial relationship you have, but it's very difficult to or impossible to block incoming transactions. And that's where you get significant issues with travel compliance. When you're executing or sending transactions onwards, there's a lot more control. So as a CASP, you control your wallets, you can choose where to send funds. So you have a lot more control on funds flowing out as opposed to funds flowing in. So that's where we see a lot of challenges in travel rule implementation. There's requirements as well, and I'll go into it in a bit more detail because here's where we see the more significant implementation challenges, which is you need to actually flag missing and incomplete information. And there's a lot of missing and incomplete information from what I've seen from working with clients and discussing with CASPs. Okay, there's guidance that was issued from the EBA, which clarifies the implementation and the expectations. It's quite comprehensive. I think it's actually quite good, even though it's very painful. But it does go into quite a lot of detail in terms of how you can implement the travel rule effectively. Again, aiming to ensure consistent application across member states, all that kind of stuff. A tricky one here, and it's been subject to a lot of debate, is even though the guidance and the travel is effective from the 30th of December 2024, CASPs get a technical grace period until July 2025. I'm still confused as to what a technical grace period means, to be honest. But I read it as a bit of like we're not going to actively enforce this until July 2025. You should still apply it. You should still have processes in place. But we're not going to force you all to have like a technical solution until 2025, which is a bit of a challenge, I think. And places certain CASPs at risk because there's inconsistent application of this particular point. And there are certain competent authorities, I think, that will push a lot harder on travel rule implementation as opposed to others, which I think maybe are reading this grace period as a bit of a non-action type of statement, and may not actively enforce the travel rule until July, whereas others will be actively enforcing the travel rule. So that's, again, just to add to the challenges that we're having in implementing the travel rule globally. It also highlights certain things that need to be done when complying with the travel rule. One is it's actually a requirement really on the service providers and the solution providers, which is the EBA want to see technical interoperability between solutions, which has historically been a big challenge. So most of what's happening right now is that CASPs or VASPs will have a travel rule solution provider, which will be a tech provider that facilitates this information flow. But as you can imagine, and as most of us know, there are multiple providers that are providing that service. So there's a big chance that your counterpart is not using the same travel rule solution provider as you, and how do those solutions talk to each other? That has been a big issue in travel rule implementation. And it's still a struggle. So I still feel that the solution providers are not as interoperable as the FATF and the EBA, and probably most of the industry would like them to be as well. But yeah, the data needs to be submitted. It's not clear in terms of how this data needs to be submitted, just that it needs to be submitted securely and immediately or before, as we saw earlier. So again, another challenge in terms of certain CASPs transmitting data in different manners. I've even seen some horror stories of email-based transmission systems, which rings many alarm bells in our minds, I would say. There's a requirement to flag and manage incomplete missing data, which again is a huge one because there is a lot of missing and incomplete data right now when it comes to travel rule communication. But you still need to make sure it's secure, reliable, and GDPR compliant. So yeah, you need to transmit all of this highly sensitive information, but at the same time, need to do it securely as well. And that's very difficult to achieve in practice. Okay, this is just a chart showing the data sharing requirements. I'm not going to go into it in a lot of detail for the sake of time, but I think we're going to share the slides after the session. So happy for you to use it as a reference document, but this is basically showing what information needs to be shared and who is verifying the information. So on the originator side, makes sense, you will be verifying all of this originator information, name, address, account number, their physical address, or date and place of birth, a whole load of things. And on the beneficiary side, this beneficiary information is being verified. And then you have this sort of swap where this information is shared between both CASPs. Okay, self-hosted wallet is a very topical and challenging area as well. So when you're communicating information between CASPs, still not easy, and it's still very complicated, and there's lots of challenges that we've seen. But it's quite unique in the sense, or I guess maybe more similar to the traditional world, where you'd have like banks or payment companies communicating between each other on a SWIFT network. Here, what we're looking at is when there are transactions from a CASP either to a self-hosted or unhosted wallet, as a FATF call it, or receiving transactions from a self-hosted wallet, the travel rule actually still applies. So you still need to obtain certain information. So what they're saying is that if you receive transactions from a self-hosted wallet, you should still receive the originator data, but you would receive it from whoever is sending you that transaction from the self-hosting wallet. And likewise, if you're sending funds out to a self-hosted wallet, you need to understand who they're going to and receive that information as a CASP. So that is very difficult. You need to collect the full information. You need to verify that information and the ownership of the wallet when it's over €1,000. So Under €1,000, you need to receive the information. There's, in my view, significant issues and potential risks here, because what's happening mostly is that you are asking whoever sent you the funds to self-declare. And I think users will be very incentivized to say, this is my wallet I'm sending you the funds from, just to avoid any additional due diligence or complications from the CASP. So a lot of CASP, what they're doing is saying, is this your wallet that you are funding your account with? And someone will say, yes, it's me. And it'll go through very easily. And I have a feeling that a lot of those transactions maybe are not actually being funded from the individual, but from maybe other sources. And likewise on the way out as well, the CASP or the VASP will say, are you sending this to your own wallet? Chances are someone's going to say yes. It isn't unless the value is over 1,000 that then you need to actually verify this information. So I'm not sure what value the collection of the information actually achieves, to be honest, especially for transactions under €1,000. When it goes to over €1,000, then it's another level of complexity. You need to actually verify ownership. And there's a big question as to how do you verify ownership of a self-hosted wallet? There's been many attempts to come up with processes to do this. The guidelines are actually quite helpful, so they do give you like a certain number of potential methods to verify ownership. They're not all perfect or ideal. One of them is signing a message, which I think is one of the questions that we can look at later, where basically a user, a user will be able to connect their wallet to the CASP platform and sign a message from that wallet saying, I have control of this wallet, this is my signed message. Because I've signed this message, obviously I have access to the private keys, so I control this wallet. In theory, quite a good way of assessing whether ownership occurs. But as a crypto user for many years, I get very nervous whenever I need to connect my wallet to anything. So I imagine other people are equally as worried. And I don't know how willing many customers would be to connect their wallets to CASP sites. There could be vulnerabilities. The CASP, for example, could be exploited, and by connecting your wallet, your funds could be diverted. So there's quite a lot of concerns with message signing, even though it's quite commonly used. Another one is microtransfer, which is commonly referred to as the Satoshi test. So send me a small denomination of crypto from this wallet, so I know that you're sending it. I don't know, send me like 5 Satoshis. And if you receive those 5 Satoshis, it's likely that that individual or entity controls the wallet. Again, I think there's flaws to that, because you could just ask whoever you want the funds to go to send the Satoshis you've been requested, and there's very little way of verifying that ownership. So there's a lot of challenges when it comes to ownership. And I think going back to the conversation we had earlier in terms of the effectiveness, I'd query the effectiveness of a lot of these approaches. And even further, I'd also say the level of cost to CASPs to actually implement some of these ownership verification methods really disincentivizes people from transacting with self-hosted wallets in the first place. The additional level of compliance checks and hoops that you need to go through to be able to satisfy this requirement makes it less commercially viable, I think, to even interact with self-hosted wallets. So I think we're going to see a lot of challenges when it comes to moving from the regulated crypto world to the on-chain world because of these additional hoops you need to go through, the additional costs. As a user as well, as soon as I'm sending funds from a CASP to someone that isn't me, the CASP needs to do due diligence on a third party, and they actually need to imply enhanced due diligence. So as soon as I'm sending funds from like my, let's say it's a centralized wallet, and I want to use that to pay my cleaner, then in theory, this CASP will need to do enhanced due diligence on my cleaner. That is going to be very impractical. I don't think anyone is going to want to do that. So I think what will happen is that if I want to pay anything on chain, I'll probably send my funds to my own wallet, sign a message from my own wallet, and then I'll send that to whoever I want onwards. So I think we're going to see very little, if any, third-party payments from CASPs to self-hosted wallets just because of this EDD requirement. Again, questioning how effective some of this will be, but this is the challenge that we're seeing right now. So CASPs that are interacting with self-hosted wallets really need to consider this wallet ownership question. I think when we're discussing practical implementation, I think the easiest thing is to make sure that you don't allow third-party transfers, because the level of EDD and challenge in third-party transfers are just going to be probably uncommercial for most businesses. So make sure that you are allowing your customer to withdraw to their own wallet, have them sign a transaction or verify ownership of that wallet. And if they want to make third-party transactions onwards, then they can do so. And as we said earlier, transactions between self-hosted wallets aren't in scope of the travel rules. So I think that's probably where we're heading in terms of practical implementation as well. A big one as well, counterparty due diligence and cross-border risk. So there's a requirement to assess your counterpart CASPs. There's a special considerations on non-EU entities as well. So, and this is looking, if you're familiar to like the banking sector, like this is looking at correspondent banking type due diligence. So you need to be aware of which CASPs you are sending funds to and actually assess them from a risk perspective. So you actually need to make a decision as to whether these CASPs that you are dealing with are low, medium, or high risk, or however you choose to risk weight these entities. And if high risk, you need to do a further due diligence. You may even need to consider not allowing transactions to be sent or received from these counterparts as well. So that's also a significant implementation challenge that we're seeing in the travel rule. Just one thing to mention, and this is more of like a practical implementation challenge, and we were actually quite involved as Xreg in this from the beginning, and it's actually thinking about your data and how your data is structured. So most travel solutions require your data to be standardized and prepared in a certain way, so you can then feed your data into these solutions. And we were actually quite involved in this data standards that was developed when the travel rule was first brought in, which arose really out of a need to have standardized information. Because if you're sharing customer information with a counterpart, it makes sense to have all of that information in the same language, so to speak. So something simple as like, do you have like first name and last name, or last name and first name, or do you use American dates or European dates? What characters do you use when structuring your data? And it's all about making sure your data is structured in a certain way, so that when you do exchange data under the travel rule, it can communicate as seamlessly as possible between CASPs. So this is a data standard called IVMS 101 that the majority, if not all, of the travel rule solution providers use. We were part of a big working group. I think there were about 100 experts that prepared and worked on this standard, and it's been applied by most CASPs. So even thinking about the travel rule, like one of the starting points is looking at how your data is structured, so that when you do share that data, it can communicate well with other providers. So just worth bearing in mind and taking a look at that standard. It's out there. It's free to download and to use. So it's worth looking at whether your data is standardized and it's set in compliance with IVMS 101, Intervast Messaging Standard 101. Okay, risk mitigation and execution decisions. So again, this is a big part of where we see challenges in implementing the travel rule. So you actually need to have risk-based policies for whether you execute, reject, or suspend transfers. So if a transfer is fully travel rule compliant, if you're working with the same travel rule solution provider, for example, in the same jurisdiction, in theory, complying with the travel rule should be quite easy, because you're just exchanging information between a software. We're using a software provider that will make things as seamless as possible. But when we look at actual implementation of the travel rule, it's not always as easy. You could have different solution providers. As I said earlier, you can receive transactions from anywhere in the world, and it may not be tagged, or you may not have a request, a travel rule compliant request from a counterparty. So what do you do with those transactions? So you need to have policies in place for assessing these like non-compliant transactions. And you need to take corrective actions. So just to go into a bit more detail, because I think this is a key point, and this is from the travel rule guidance, from the EBA travel rule guidance. So you need to set out, and this is actually just word for word, just so you can see the exact requirement. You need to set out in your policies and procedures how you determine whether to reject, suspend, or execute a transfer. You need to list the risk factors you will consider for these transfers, and where the rejection is technically not possible, such as when you receive deposits, the transfer should be returned to the originator, which again, I think can ring many alarm bells from an AML perspective. So you can receive a transfer from a high risk address, maybe something to do with terrorist financing, criminal activity, dark web links. And he is saying technically you should return to the originator, which I think is incorrect in some cases. So you need to be very careful, I think, with how you approach some of these particular transactions. And then the actual guidance, the EBA guidance, sets some deadlines. So you actually need to request missing information from counterparties with a deadline of no more than 3 working days in Europe and 5 outside. So if you start receiving these non-compliant transactions, like you actually need to proactively request missing information. If not, then you need to take decision as to whether reject, suspend transactions. So I think, as with many things in compliance, if things are working as intended, probably not as painful as we would think. But that's not the case in all cases. And we do have a lot of these transactions, especially given the way the travel is not being effectively or equally implemented globally as well. And then the guidance goes on to say that if you are dealing with a non-cooperative CASP on the other side, you need to consider the future treatment and your relationship with that CASP. So you may see that you are receiving transactions constantly from one particular CASP. You may have to cease transacting with that CASP in the future if you keep getting these recurring non-compliant transfers and issues. So yeah, this is the implementation timeline, which we've covered as well. So, I mean, one thing to highlight, I think, is that even though you have this approach where not all jurisdictions are enforcing the travel rule equally, I think we can expect in Europe, at least from July onwards, that we'll see enforcement ramping up. So yeah, I think I've covered some of the differences between Europe and FATF. So for the interest of time, I just keep the slide here. We also created this graphic a while back as VASPNet, which is our data company, just to show like some of the differences between the FATF and the TOFA requirements. But I think this also, and I've got a few more slides now in terms of practical challenges, simply having different requirements for information sharing between Europe and potentially other jurisdictions creates a huge issue in complying with the travel rule in the first place. Because European CASPs are collecting certain information, and then VASPs or otherwise globally maybe collecting other information, and how does that information get adequately shared? How do you obtain all the information you need as a European CASP when other CASPs may not be obtaining the same level of information? All of these add to the challenges of complying with the travel rule. So yeah, I'm just conscious of time, but I think just to summarize the key challenges that I see, and then I'll give some recommendations at the end. One of the biggest challenges is this fragmentation across jurisdictions. So as we've seen, we have different transposition timelines, different interpretations, even different thresholds between the EU and abroad. So another example, if you have this 0 threshold in Europe, but your counterpart in another jurisdiction has an $1,000 threshold, then the European CASP may be required to obtain certain information that the counterpart VASP may not even have, because they're not required to obtain that information. So how do you address this sort of like loggerhead where it's just not there, they're not under requirement to obtain the information that you need? So that's one source of friction as well. Another one is on the enforcement of the travel rule. So certain jurisdictions are actively enforcing the travel rule, some are being more lenient. So what do you do when you want to receive information from a jurisdiction that is not enforcing the travel rule yet? Another huge challenge. Even within EU member states, I'm sure you've seen certain jurisdictions apply different standards or have different supervisory expectations, even with the travel rule. So a VASP or CASP in France versus one in Lithuania could actually have different expectations. So that's, I think, probably one of the number one challenges. This is an extract from the FATF's latest progress report, and they've actually said that 1/3 of jurisdictions have not even passed legislation for the travel rule. So that's 1 out of 3 CASP potentially, given that the numbers and the disparity is not going to be exact, but that will not actually have anything for the travel rule. And then only 26% are actually enforcing the travel rule. So there's a lot of jurisdictions that have legislated for the travel rule, but not really doing anything about it either. So when you only have 26% of jurisdictions enforcing the travel rule and you're one of the unlucky ones that have to comply, it becomes very difficult to actually implement it properly, because crypto is a very cross-border industry. And it's very likely that some of your cross-border counterparts are not actually enforcing the travel rule at this stage. So this is just an extract from the report, just showing there has actually been quite a bit of progress, and there was quite a lot of progress between 2013 and 2014. So hopefully, in an ideal world, maybe this is just like teething issues. It's a gradual process, and eventually, in a few years from now, most jurisdictions will be enforcing the travel rule, and this sunrise issue, as the FATF call it, will not be as much of a problem. The data sharing, I think we've covered already. So there is a lack of standardized messaging protocols. There's lots of different technical solutions. They don't all really talk to each other as well as they should. And then we've got this concern about data security, encryption, real-time delivery, how we can actually achieve that properly. Has been a big challenge. Challenge number 3 is the counterparty due diligence. Something that's not really being done effectively, in my view, by most. How do you address the risk of like a counterpart in a unregulated or lighter regulated or high-risk jurisdiction, where they may not even be complying with the travel rule, or if they are complying with the travel rule, how adequate are their controls, and how valuable and how accurate is the information that you may be receiving as well. If they're from a high-risk jurisdiction, or, for example, their processes and their policies are not adequate either. And then I just thought I'd leave you with some like action items in terms of what I would be thinking about when implementing the travel rules. So first one is make sure you implement a secure, interoperable system that is travel rule compliant. So there are a number of vendors out there. I think some are better than others. I purposely didn't include names or recommendations because I don't really want to be favoring any over others at this stage. But there are a lot of vendors out there that can help you comply with the travel rule. The originator beneficiary information, make sure that is verified, because that's a key component of the travel rule. So in Europe, unfortunately, there's little room for simplified due diligence or streamlined due diligence when you actually need to verify information that needs to be communicated under the travel rule. So unfortunately, there's that requirement there. Make sure you have a counterparty risk assessment and due diligence protocol. That can be streamlined, I think, to an extent. So you could have a process in place that if you're, for example, interacting with a regulated CASP in Europe, I think it's quite justifiable that could be considered like a low risk relationship. So the level of due diligence you need to undertake on your counterpart may not be as significant. But you just need to watch out for like non-EU high-risk relationships, I think would be one of the biggest challenges. And make sure you document and you have a clear approach as to whether you reject, suspend, or execute transactions, because that's where you're going to encounter most of your issues. when implementing the travel rule. And as you probably know, as regulated businesses, if it's not documented, it isn't done. So make sure you have formalized policies, procedures, make sure it's all documented effectively so that if you need to justify any actions taken to a regulator or evidence your compliance, that you can do that effectively. I think that is it. Hopefully I clarified a few things. I understand it's very difficult to comply with. I agree with a lot of what was said, as I said earlier, in the conversation between Lena and Greta, but unfortunately at this stage, if you want to do business in Europe, you really have to consider this quite carefully, I'd say.
Thank you, Nathan. This was very, very insightful indeed. And I think it was very easy to follow. Thank you for making us understand travel rule requirements a little bit more and even delving deeper into where the Europe is standing in the world with the FATF Recommendation 16 implementation status. And they are never happy about the status, and I'm not sure if they ever will be. But this is probably the time that's a more active part of our community that wrote the questions and observations are waiting for. So we are moving on to Q&A session. And we will try to answer in detail as much as possible and cover the topics that our dear audience wanted us to cover. So without further ado, I would like to read out the questions and let's try to answer them and have that discussion going. So first question that reached us was regarding the AOPP. It seems like the audience believes that it seems like the alternative to verify ownership on self-hosted non-custodial wallets. Do you see the regulator accepting this or other methodology to verify the ownership of a wallet as compliant for the regulator for travel purposes? And actually, the AOPP came up twice in our questions. Another person is writing that AOPP is an alternative to verify ownership of on hosted wallets. So, good trainers, what are your thoughts? Will regulators accept it as a valid way to establish ownership? What do you think?
I can take this one. And so it's actually I wouldn't even say it's an alternative. I think it's one of the valid verification methods. So if you look at the EBA guidelines, it actually says that you need to use at least one verification method. And one of the methods they say is requesting the customer to digitally sign a specific message into the account with wallet software and the key corresponding to that address. So it is actually a specified method that you can use to verify ownership of an address. I wouldn't even say it's an alternate method. I think it's a valid method that you can use. I think you just need to justify what method you're using as a CASP and whether you feel it's effective, but definitely it's something that can be used.
Thank you, Nathan, for clarifying that up. And actually, another question that came to us is quite related to this, and it was covered by you in most of in quite a detailed way. But I still want to vocalize this because it's very, very important and showcases us how concerned and how we need that more information in this topic. So another participant of our training session asks, could you please share practical tips and ideas of implementation? As at this stage, we cannot change the law, but we can find ways to get it implemented right. As on licensing and operational stages, it is crucial. And they are thanking for your feedback. I think, Nathan, you covered that quite in detail. Do you want to add something extra on this one?
The only thing I'd add is that I think when it comes to practical implementation, you'll need to weigh up like the commercial benefits and the pain, I guess, in complying with some of this stuff. And for example, if you think that verifying ownership of transactions over €1,000 to self-hosted wallets is going to be extremely painful and costly from a compliance perspective for very little economic benefit, you may just say, let's cap transfers to €1,000. Personally, I wouldn't like to see that because I think people should have the right to transact over these amounts But I also see from a practical perspective that some CASPs may choose to do that. The other example I gave earlier is you may want to restrict third-party transfers, because third-party transfers over €1,000 mean that you need to conduct EDD on a third party who is unlikely to want to share due diligence information from you in the first place. As we know, as compliance people, that EDD is painful to conduct when you're looking at source of funds, source of wealth information, for example. So it may not be commercially viable to comply with some of these things. So I'd say make an assessment internally in terms of what you think is commercial for you, because you may not need to comply with the full. And when I say you don't need to comply, I think you will be complying, but by changing certain practices, you may reduce some of the pain points. That's what I think I'd add here.
Thank you for making that addition. It's very insightful, and I believe that the person that asked the question has more information on what they wanted to know. So let's move on to another question, and I believe this might involve us answering this one, Nina. Has anyone experience in regulators supervising results on travel rule implementation? An example, what gaps they have found, what level of understanding they have applied in the difficulties of implementation, any fines levied thus far on travel rule implementation. To date, it seems other than advising organizations, they have been measuring compliance. So I personally haven't seen the measurements of the effectiveness, and probably it's due to the fact that it's quite early and we have the grace period that was kindly reminded to us by Nathan. But Nina, have you observed anything related specifically to crypto? Any measurements regarding the effectiveness of travel rule and the gaps of information?
No, measurements I didn't notice. And I think Nathan really pointed out, where the difficulties are. And the regulators are very familiar with these. That's why they came to the conclusion to give this grace period until summer. So, yeah, I think Nathan really covered this pretty well.
Yeah, thank you, Nina. So I guess we will have to wait and see. Maybe there will be some insights in how well we are doing or not so well. But for now, I guess we are trying to fully implement it, and then we can start measuring it. How lucky or not lucky we were. Anyways, let's move on to another question. And somebody is asking us to share insights on travel rule for MiCA. I guess this probably was covered by all of the presentations and discussion here, because this is what we were discussing. As MiCA specifically doesn't regulate travel rule, the transfer funds regulation does within the EU. There's another message in our chat, and I think it's an observation, so I would like to read it out for you all. The person writing to us says that I feel like a strong mitigating factors is where there is a transfer between WASP and a WASP-B. Each independently must have KYC, hence why should they exchange that data? If illicit activity is identified on chain, the authorities can go to WASP-A and WASP-B to establish the identities behind those wallet addresses. This framework is fit to wire transfers, not for crypto.
I can pick on that one, Frida, because
Sure.
this is a very common misunderstanding, right? So if WASP-A is located in Lithuania and WASP-B is located in Germany, right? The German police cannot immediately go to WASP-A in Lithuania, right? There is an official procedure for the police to obtaining that information. And that is the reason why we have the travel rule in the first place, right? It is the information barrier between nation states. So that's why we also talked about it, Greta, earlier in our talk. That's maybe where the problem stems from, and where we need to rethink the collaboration of prosecutors and enforcement between states, because that is the burden that we're dealing with here.
Oh, thank you for bringing that one up. I think it's another pain that we're looking remedies for, because collaboration and cooperation between the different nation states is not as effective as we would like it to be, and we have space for improvements. And even though on paper it could look as a valid proposal, I agree with you. We still need to do a lot of work, and in practice it doesn't really work that well. So thank you for sharing that insight. And I see that the new questions are popping up, and I'm really, really excited about it. It means that you stayed till the very end of this training session, and I hope not only for the certificates, but also for the knowledge and insights from the dear trainers of ours. So another person is writing that 1,000 euro threshold is for one of the transactions of POW, so proof of work, or I don't know, which it meant POW of self-hosted wallets. What about breaking down in 2 payments or more within a time frame in less than 1 minute, for example? So basically, the person wants to know what if somebody is breaking the payment into 2 not to reach the threshold. And I see that Nathan, maybe you would like to get that one. Yeah.
Unfortunately, it's something that you can't really get around because you need to look for linked transactions. So there's a requirement that you need to check whether transactions are like linked together. And that's something you see in other parts of AML-CFT regulation as well. So the CASP should have processes in place to make sure that they're looking out for this kind of activity. And if they consider the transactions to be linked, then it's as if they are above the 1,000 euro threshold. So I think it's something that users will undoubtedly try and do maybe to avoid certain verification, but the CASP needs to look out for that kind of stuff.
So basically, it's up for the CASP to make sure that they don't miss that.
Yeah, in the guidelines, I've actually got it in front of me. So page 16, at the bottom, it says you need to have policies and procedures in place to detect transfers that appear to be linked. So you need to treat transfers that are linked as a single transaction, and you need to consider whether there's transactions within like a short time frame, that kind of stuff. So you need to look out for it. You need to have processes in place to try and pick those things up.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up and letting everyone know that they might want to read the EBA guidance. Okay, another person is sharing their insights about the grace period, and they are writing, I think it means that if you have issues to connect with some protocols, you have until July 2025 to solve these issues. Yeah, you're correct, I think. Another person asks, who should enforce the travel rule compliance for CASPs, regulators or electronic money institutions? And this is a very interesting question, a rather philosophical one, I would say, that if the CASP is a customer of another obliged entity that's electronic money institution, who is the first one there to make sure that the CASP is following the requirements? So my personal take on this one would be that it could be that MEs are also very, very strictly observing and asking too many questions in order to make sure that they are covering the risks. But also, I think regulators are the responsible ones to make sure that everything's being followed through. What about your thoughts, Nathan, Nina?
Yeah, I think that's basically correct, right? In order to protect itself, the e-money institution will need to make sure that they only deal with compliant service providers, right? That's also had been mentioned by Nathan. You need to do your like KYB also on your business partners, not only on your own customers. But ultimately, obviously, enforcement as such is done by official agencies, so police, law enforcement, right? So if you understand that term in a strict sense, then obviously that's done by public authorities.
True. I agree with you. So let's move on to another question because I see so many of them. I am so happy you cannot imagine. I hope that reflects through the screen to the audience and the trainers because it's really having these questions. It means that everyone was tuned into our conversation and presentations. So another person is asking, have you seen lately any technology fine-tuning methodology to diminish the amount of false positives or to assign those effectively to automation and discard or reduce human interaction? I don't know about discarding human interaction, but maybe any solutions that could reduce the need for man work. Personally, I couldn't comment on this one.
No, and I think, this is due to the incentives, right? There is no incentive to really spend money on developing those tools because the incentive is rather to report rather too much than too little.
Yeah, I guess maybe just to add a bit to that in terms of like in terms of practically what's happening, most CASPs have a travel rule solution provider. So to the extent that you have a travel rule solution that is communicating with another one, you would hope that there'd be very little issues with those transactions. Where I think you do get significant issues, as I said earlier, is when you have a third party sending you transactions that is either not on your travel rule solution or you just simply can't identify them. And I think CASPs will need to develop technological solutions to address this because it's just going to be too much manual work for compliance teams to deal with. So I think there will be some automation. Have I seen specific solutions that help with that? I don't think so. But I think eventually, and I think some of the bigger companies will have to automate requests or queries with counterparts because if not, it's just going to be unmanageable, I'd say.
Well, thank you for sharing that insights with us, Nathan and Nina. We have another person asking us about off-ramp, on-ramp service providers, and they want to know, and because there are specifically two questions about this, how they are affected by the travel rule, and is only executing transmission of orders, no crypto transfers. Well, how they should approach this? Yeah,
They are in scope.
they are.
I think there's just to clarify, there's sometimes there are certain transactions that as a CASP you need to comply with the travel rule, right? But the travel rule applies when there's an originator and beneficiary relationship between CASPs. So I have seen, for example, some activities like if you have a client that is interacting with a CASP directly on own account and there's no underlying originator and beneficiary relationship, even though you need to comply with the travel rule, it won't be a travel rule in-scope transaction. So there may be cases, I think, where if there is no underlying customer, so if I'm a CASP that is transacting or sending a transaction from Nina to Greta, at another CASP, for sure, that would be a travel rule in scope transaction. But if I'm let's say I'm a CASP that's dealing on own account and Greta is approaching me to purchase some Bitcoin for euros, there's no underlying customer that we are sending a value, or there's no underlying value flow to an external or third party client. In that case, then you will not have to communicate any travel information because there's no counterparty CASP to communicate with. So that's why I think it can be a bit technical and I've seen some confusion. Because the whole point of the travel is to communicate information between crypto companies, right? So, and it's about their clients. So if there's no underlying client that you're communicating or sending value for, then the travel won't be in scope. So that's where sometimes you can see when there's certain I guess broker-dealer type activities where you are legally facing your clients and there's no third party originator beneficiary relationship, then at times the travel won't apply. And likewise, I think when we're looking at the reception and transmission of orders, I'm not too sure actually, and maybe we can get back to you, is whether the reception and transmission of order is a travel rule in scope transaction, because there's no like flow of value that you're affecting. You're just reflecting like a message and information. So that's a tricky one. I need to look on that one. I need to look into a bit more detail. But again, there needs to be a relationship between an originator and a beneficiary as well. So are you communicating a value flow between an originator and a beneficiary is the question you need to ask as well.
Thank you, Nathan, for diving a little bit deeper in this one. And we have another technical question, but it's a really important question, and I think it must be asked. So another person from the audience is asking, in cases where travel rule information cannot be transmitted due to technical issues, so lack of communication protocol or delays in response from the beneficiary CASP, example via email. I'm not so sure about the emails, but if we have encountered technical issues and we have some information missing, so what are the recommended steps to remain compliant? Any ideas that we could propose to our audience? What to do if we are missing the information? Well, most certainly not submitting a suspicious transaction report just to prevent us from being scrutinized by the regulator. But if we have missing information and there's something that we need to do. So Nathan, Nina, could you add something to this? What would be your recommendation?
Well, I mean, the transfer of funds regulation requests that information is shared prior to or together with undertaking the transaction. So I would say you need to put that transaction on hold and try to solve the issue first.
Yeah,
I'd agree with Nina, and I think I covered some of that in the presentation. So make sure you have like a documented process in place that covers transactions which do not have the information, and then you need to decide how to respond. Make the information requests that you need to with the 3 working days, and if you don't receive that information, then you need to decide what to do with it.
yeah. Thank you so much for shedding the light on the topic. And I see that some of the questions are a little bit repeating themselves, so just give me a moment. Here's a new one. So another person wants to know, how should an EU-based CASP handle travel rule appliance when interacting with CASP in Latin America, where the travel rule may not be implemented or enforced? So this is probably one of the aspects that we were talking quite a lot about. If there is no travel rule implemented, and Nathan, you covered that one, I guess. What to do when there is no travel rule to begin with?
Maybe just to add like practically what I see happening, it may already be, even if the travel rule is not being enforced in that particular jurisdiction, if they are a big player and they are interacting with regulated entities, they may actually be complying with the travel rule voluntarily, because their counterparts will not receive transactions for them if they're not sharing the information. So you do have certain CASPs that, even if like the travel rule is not being implemented in a certain jurisdiction, if they want to plug into this network and if they want to interact with certain regulated CASPs, they may actually be on a travel rule solution, which is quite an interesting one. But it's just showing that you may actually be like locked out of the transaction flows, even if your home jurisdiction doesn't have the travel rule in place. So I have seen that in certain cases, to be honest.
Thank you for sharing that insight. Another person is asking, what could be practical tips for dealing with the sunrise issue? Anyone would like to delve on this one?
Basically the same answer, I would say,
Yeah.
as Nathan just gave, right?
Yeah.
So hope that you find a counterpart that is voluntarily applying the travel rules so that you are enabled to interact with that one.
Exactly. Very good answer. Thank you. So There is no way of escaping of being compliant. We need to remain that, and even if it's difficult, then we find others that help us stay that way, right? So let's move on to another question. And another person is asking, what about payments via crypto payment providers? How are they expected to get the information from their customers? And I think since part of the question somehow due technical reasons are missing, so probably it's around the third party about the customers of the merchants. And if we are facing troubles getting the information about our customer's customer, how we should continue in these situations. And I am not so sure if I grasped the essence of this question, and if the trainers, do you have anything to add? Because I know that it's not very clear, and I am facing technical issues reading it in full because it's missing some bits of information.
I think what it's trying to say is if you're a crypto payment provider and your business model is to send third-party payments and you're expected to do EDD on each of those payments,
Mm-hmm.
and that's going to represent a significant challenge to your business. Honestly, I don't know what the answer is practically. I would imagine that your clients have conducted due diligence on their relationships. So there may be a way of exchanging or having a more streamlined approach where your client will let you know who their approved third-party providers are and documenting due diligence on all of them. So I think maybe there's some streamlined or more streamlined ways of achieving what you want. But if you're sending those transfers to a unhosted wallet, then that's when the EDD kicks in. It's a tricky one.
Yeah. Thank you for helping me out in this one, Nathan, because it's sometimes a bit difficult to understand what the question is aiming at, especially if some information is missing from it.
I made an assumption, but I think that's where the question maybe is going.
Yeah, probably. I hope we answered that question. And we have one last question in the chat. And it's rather a technical one, so I hope that we will manage to answer that one in full as well. So the quick question regarding crypto payment gateways. If a Shopify, based store integrates a crypto payment gateway plugin, does the gateway provider has an obligation to perform enhanced due diligence on the store's clients? And this is a rather interesting one.
It's a tricky one, and I hope the answer is no. Because I
would agree.
where you have to EDD to buy something from Shopify. I think if you're integrating a payment gateway and your client is Shopify and not Shopify's clients, there may be an argument that it's not a travel rule in scope transaction. So you're not executing there's no originator beneficiary relationship. It's just a payment of a good or service, and you're just assisting with a collection of those fees, or which belongs to Shopify and not to the underlying client. So in this case, Shopify won't be holding client value. So you may be able to argue that there's no originator beneficiary relationship. It's more almost like a broker dealer type relationship that we mentioned earlier, where you're just allowing for the acceptance of this payment, but you're not executing a value transfer from an originator to a beneficiary. So, but it's quite technical. I think you have to look at it in detail. But as I said, I hope the answer is no, because if not, then it's going to kill a lot of models. Yeah,
I agree with you, because if the answer is yes, it gets scary. So honestly, I hope the answer is no, and you explained it perfectly. Thank you. That's why we are having you here today. And I see that somebody else decided just to give one more question, and I am very grateful for that one. So the question goes as follows. Let's assume CASP is serving e-commerce, for example, Piguelte. That's just the little bit background. It's a Lithuanian online shopping platform where everyone can purchase various goods. And the customer is paying in crypto for the product with a self-hosted product if info about the customer provided from the e-commerce is enough to satisfy the requirement. That's interestingly structured. So basically, we have e-commerce site, and the customer is providing some information while purchasing some goods from there. And is it enough to satisfy the travel rule requirement?
I think again, you have to look at how the payment flow actually is. Is such crypto payment coming from the customer to the platform, and then from the platform to the merchant, or is it directly exchanged between the customer and the merchant, right? So that brings then the crypto asset service provider of the platform or of the merchant into play, right? So it's like Nathan said regarding the previous question, you always have to look into the detail. What is precisely happening?
Yeah, I agree. It's very similar point to the last question, as Nina said.
Yeah.
And it's really understanding, like, is there an originator beneficiary relationship? Is there travel? Is it in scope in the first place? A lot of these sort of e-commerce businesses I've seen really are sort of, you're almost like exchanging crypto to fiat for third party, and you're not really affecting transfers between clients. Like, they've already received the crypto in exchange for like a good or service, and then you're just helping them accept and then usually liquidate the crypto back into fiat. So it may be that it's not in scope, hopefully.
Hopefully. I have nothing to add. You two provided fantastic answers to all of the questions. I was just vocalizing them back and forth, and I see that everybody started thanking you for amazing training session. And on behalf of the Centers team, I would like to extend my gratitude as well. You've been amazing. I really enjoyed having a discussion with you, Nina, and I enjoyed listening to you, Nathan. I believe that our dear audience now has more clear perspective on the travel rule, what's needed to comply, and hopefully they're bringing that those questions and that tingling feeling that maybe we should revisit something that we have belief in for 30 years old thing, and maybe we will and can do better for the future. Thank you so much, and I hope that our trainers will return for our training sessions sooner than later. And to the audience, let's see each other in the next online training session. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.